The FAA has banned daytime launches amidst the ongoing U.S. government shutdown. Jared Isaacman once again becomes the nominee for NASA Administrator. 3 Chinese astronauts are stranded in space! Well, sort of. Starlink secures major milestones and partnerships, and VAST successfully tests its Haven demo spacecraft with some amazing 4K views from space. We'll have all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. After a ton of drama in recent weeks and months, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that he has re-nominated Jared Isaacman to become the 15th NASA administrator. Now, I say drama because news about both the decision of whether Jared Isaacman should be the nominee and the actual position of the NASA administrator itself have been bouncing around like ping-pong balls lately. To put it all into perspective, here's a recap of how this all started. A year ago this week, Donald Trump was elected President of the United States for a second time, succeeding the previous president, Joe Biden. Every president gets to choose a NASA administrator. Trump chose Jim Bridenstine for his first term, and Joe Biden chose Bill Nelson for his term. In December of 2024, Trump announced that he had planned to nominate Jared Isaacman to the position of NASA administrator. As was tradition, Bill Nelson then resigned from his position once Joe Biden's term ended on January 20th, 2025, and he was replaced by the director of the Kennedy Space Center, Janet Petro, in the role of acting administrator. Later that day, following his inauguration, Trump officially nominated Isaacman to be the NASA administrator, setting the wheels of bureaucracy in motion. You see, the nomination has to be approved by the U.S. Senate, first with a vote carried out by the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, before then moving to the full Senate. But even before that first committee's vote, the nominee has to appear in front of the committee for a routine evaluation hearing. Well, that hearing took place on April 9th and was shared with the hearing of Olivia Trusty, who was nominated at the time to be a member of the Federal Communications Commission. Isaacman's nomination was approved by the committee on April 30th and was set to proceed to the full Senate with 19 votes in favor and 9 against. The full Senate nomination vote was supposed to occur a bit over a month later in early June, but on May 31st, Trump rescinded his nomination, citing Isaacman's previous donations to the Democratic Party. Then in July, after the passing of the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, Trump changed NASA's acting administrator position from Janet Petro, a civil servant, to a member of his own cabinet, Secretary of Transportation Sean Duffy. So while we were all still waiting to see what would happen with the nomination for the actual NASA administrator, the acting administrator role was also changed. See what I mean about the ping pong? It really was kind of a bit of a crazy time. But of course, at some point, an actual nomination had to be made, and part of Duffy's job as acting administrator was to look for potential candidates. By September, the relationship between Isaacman and the Trump administration had recovered to the point of him meeting with the president on a few occasions, as well as meeting with Sean Duffy. As we reported in recent weeks, this was also not without drama. At one point, it was even rumored that Duffy had actually come to like his job as the head of NASA a little too much due to all of the exciting press opportunities that he enjoyed as compared to the less favorable press dealings regarding the Department of Transportation. At one point, there was even some discussion of him wanting to fold NASA into the Department of Transportation, thus becoming the de facto head of NASA. But that was a couple weeks ago, and since then, there has been some progress to push Jared's nomination back up to the forefront. And so far, it seems to have worked, given Trump's announcement earlier this week that he had re-nominated Jared for NASA administrator. Following the announcement, Sean Duffy himself congratulated Isaacman for the nomination and said he'll ensure that the transition will be seamless. Senator Ted Cruz, chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, which Isaacman had appeared before back in April, also congratulated Jared on social media for his nomination. So now that Jared Isaacman is once again the nominee, will he need to once again go through a hearing and committee vote to then get to the full vote by the Senate? Well, maybe not. There are mechanisms by which Isaacman's nomination could be sped through, even in the current government shutdown environment, but as usual, that's something that will be better known once the process is closer to completion. All of this back and forth and the fight for NASA's leadership has also uncovered the Athena Plan. This was a multi-hundred-page document that Isaacman wrote during the time of his first nomination, in which he laid out a set of changes and ideas involving how he would run and improve NASA. A slimmed-down version of this document, with just 62 pages, was allegedly given to Sean Duffy following his appointment as acting administrator. This was then used in the last few weeks against Isaacman as part of those efforts to prevent his re-nomination. Isaacman acknowledged the existence of this plan in a post on X, but that, quote, "a few sentences cherry-picked from 62-plus pages is not a summary, it is just a political operative trying to achieve an outcome rather than convey facts." After which, he then proceeded to give a few bullet points on what his plan was actually about, but without giving too much detail. During his first time as nominee, Jared generally kept a low profile, rarely appearing in the media or attending events, but in recent days, he's become much more vocal about NASA. Perhaps not long from now, we'll actually get to know in greater detail all of the plans that he mapped out for NASA and whether he's now going to have to fight with Congress to enact them, or if it'll be a smooth ride. Although, if history has shown us anything, it's probably not going to be that smooth. On the topic of government shutdowns and Sean Duffy, there's even more news about him. But no, this time it's not about NASA, but rather his other job as the Secretary of Transportation. Remember when I mentioned him liking his job at NASA better since there was more positive press than that of Secretary of Transportation? Well, this story gives you a little bit of a taste of that. Since the start of fiscal year 2026 on October 1st, the United States has had no budget approved and also no continuing resolutions that could keep the government funded. So this triggers what's known as a government shutdown. That shutdown is still ongoing as of this recording, and that's meant that several programs have seen their funding cut, with only a select few deemed as essential still running on reserve funding or just without paying personnel at all. This has been the case of the Air Traffic Control Service, which has been impacted in recent weeks due to controllers having to work without pay for extended periods of time. In an emergency order issued on November 6th by the Secretary of Transportation, Sean Duffy, the Federal Aviation Administration issued a series of rules and prohibitions to reduce the workload and toll on the ATC. Now, while most of these concerned aircraft traffic, there was one piece about space launches. After all, rockets still have to go through FAA-regulated airspace. In Section 4B of the document, the FAA ordered that, quote, beginning at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on November 10, 2025, and until this order is canceled, commercial space launches and re-entries will only be permitted between 10 o'clock p.m. and 6 o'clock a.m. local time. Now, we tried to contact the FAA to ask some simple questions about this, such as what drove the decision for it to be that specific window, and whether this applies to all launches or only those under FAA licensing. For example, launches for NASA's Launch Services Program tend to be under NASA's own licensing, while launches like Starlink or even operational Crew Dragon flights are under FAA licensing. But air traffic control surely doesn't care whether the rocket traveling through the air is commercially licensed or licensed by the government. After all, the FAA issues airspace restrictions for all launches, regardless of the type. And unfortunately, because we are in fact in a government shutdown, the FAA is not responding to media requests. Frankly, airspace restrictions for launches are probably the least of the concerns of lawmakers when it comes to the shutdown, but it will definitely affect air travel and commerce, so fingers crossed that this will all be resolved very soon. On last week's episode of This Week in Spaceflight, we covered the launch of the Shenzhou 21 mission, the latest crew rotation mission to the Tiangong space station. Just like on the International Space Station, during crew rotations on the Chinese space station, a new crew launches to the station first before the old crew is set to return home. This allows for an overlap period where the new crew gets used to space, gets familiarized with the station, its systems and experiments, and a whole lot more. They even got to try out a new cooking oven for the station. The crew was able to make chicken wings and eat them together, and well, just look at them. Look how happy they are. Now, of course, for the old crew to return home, their spacecraft needs to be ready to go. Normally, this means performing hardware checkouts, visual inspections, and other final reviews of the space and ground systems. But a few days after the launch of Shenzhou 21, the China Manned Space Agency, also known as CMSA, released a statement saying that the Shenzhou 20 spacecraft may have been struck by a small piece of space debris, and that impact analysis and risk assessment were underway. So because of that, they decided to delay the return of the old crew until their safety was ensured. Now, in our intro, we said they're stranded as a sort of joking reference to last year's space drama regarding Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore, who had their stay on the ISS extended due to thruster issues with their Starliner spacecraft. Remember that? But very much like what we said back then, it's really not that uncommon for astronauts to see their stay in space lengthened for unexpected reasons, and we even made a whole video about some of the stories of other stranded astronauts in space. Like Sunny and Butch, the crew of Shenzhou 20, consisting of Commander Cheng Dong, operator Chen Zhongwei, and flight engineer Wang Jie, still have some options to return home. And let's not forget that they're currently still safely inside the Tiangong space station, and once again, a reminder that they were just happily enjoying chicken wings. So yeah, again, plenty of food and supplies, and they're not in risk of danger or anything. Even if the station wasn't technically made for a permanent presence of 6 crew members, it can sustain them temporarily. This situation with Shenzhou 20 actually has a lot in common with what happened to the Soyuz MS-22 spacecraft back in 2022. The spacecraft launched in September 2022, and just 3 months later, its service module cooling system suffered a leak, an issue that still hasn't been fully understood to this day. The spacecraft could have been used after that, but without a functioning cooling system, the conditions inside the spacecraft during the crew's return might have been too hot and humid for comfort, even if it were survivable. So the decision was to launch the next Soyuz spacecraft, Soyuz MS-23, uncrewed and use it to replace the Soyuz MS-22's role as a lifeboat on the ISS for its crew. This meant that all 3 crew members spent a whole year in space due to this spacecraft issue. Unfortunately, we're not sure about the extent of the damage on Shenzhou 20 because all that the CMSA released was that statement that I mentioned earlier. But normally, the Chinese ready the next crew spacecraft in parallel to the one that's about to launch in the event that something like this happens. It's similar to what NASA did a few times with the space shuttle by using one as a rescue craft in case the previous one malfunctioned or was damaged. A couple of months ago in September, the Shenzhou 22 spacecraft and its Tiangong 2F rocket were brought to the Zhochuan Satellite Launch Center for pre-launch processing. So it wouldn't be surprising if the spacecraft could be ready in just a few weeks and launched to the Tiangong space station, uncrewed, to replace the Shenzhou 20 spacecraft. In that case, the crew of Shenzhou 20 would likely return on Shenzhou 21, and the crew of the latter would use the newly arrived Shenzhou 22 spacecraft as their lifeboat and return spacecraft. That is, of course, if it all actually gets to that point that they can't use Shenzhou 20. Here's hoping that that's not the case, though, and that everything is deemed safe for the crew in the nominal plan, even if a bit late. As we've covered here in the past, it's never easy having to remake plans, crew schedules, and spacecraft assignments. In fact, it's kind of a mess. This week, there were a few space station-related stories, so this next section will be all about them. And we're going to start with VAST and their Haven 1 space station. A few episodes ago, we mentioned that the company had begun testing the primary structure for that space station, and now it's officially complete. As CEO Max Haut said on social media, the shipment, acceptance test, and shipping back of the flight-grade primary structure took them just 1.5 weeks, a great improvement compared to the over 6 months with the qualification article that they tested earlier this year. Now VAST will perform final inspections and begin integration in their clean room. But you know, if they've learned anything from all of this, it's that it's always good to have something else to test out all of the procedures and equipment first before building the real thing. So in that spirit, last year, VAST started building a small demonstrator satellite called Haven Demo, which contained some of the critical space station systems, but in a more compact size. Something that could be launched as a rideshare, like, say, on last week's launch of Bandwagon 4, and that could test many of the systems that'll eventually be installed on Haven 1. And that's exactly what happened. And now, they've not only shared that they're happy with the success that they've had thus far, but they've also posted videos of Haven Demo from orbit on social media. Here's hoping we get to see more like this soon, and maybe next year we'll get similar shots from Haven 1 as well. Another company getting ready to launch their space station is Axiom Space. Axiom has also been sharing some of their progress on social media in the last few days and weeks. For instance, they showed functional testing of the window shutters that will cover the windows for each of the crew quarters. It's a rather important tool if you want to be able to look out of the window, but also not be blinded by sunlight while you're asleep in your cabin. In the spirit of Halloween, Axiom also posted this picture of the conical tunnel for the Axiom docking adapter. That's the piece that goes on one of the ends of the module so that they go from their full diameter down to the diameter of the docking port. In the picture, the piece was undergoing fluorescent penetration inspection so that they could detect cracks in the surface of the structure. But it looks kind of ghostly or alien, hence the spooky post. The company also posted this video of the milling of one of the hatches that'll be part of the station's modules. This one in particular, based on its smaller size and circular shape, looks to be for a docking port rather than the usually larger and square-shaped berthing ports. Hopefully not long from now, we'll see one of those being opened in space by a welcoming crew member at the International Space Station. And continuing on the topic of space stations, we go to China, where a team from the Institute of Mechanics of the Chinese Academy of Sciences has performed a ground test of the core module of its reconfigurable, flexible, on-orbit manufacturing platform. This platform is set to be a space station consisting of a fixed service module and an inflatable habitable area, which will be used for in-space manufacturing of components and materials in the microgravity environment of low Earth orbit. According to the team, the inflatable technology uses a steel skeleton and a high-tech fiber skin that can be folded up tightly during launch and then inflate and unfold in space. The tests carried out demonstrated inflation and deployment, sealing performance, and the dynamics of the module. Further tests were also carried out in vacuum chambers to simulate the vacuum conditions of space. Now, while this is quite a breakthrough for them, when looking at the concept render for the station, you can't help but notice that it looks awfully like the old design of the Starlab space station during the old Voyager Space and Lockheed Martin collaboration. Now we'll take a look at some other stories across space, starting with SpaceX's Starlink internet satellite constellation. This week, SpaceX announced that it now has 8 million active users across more than 150 countries and territories. The announcement comes on the heels of another major milestone. Just a few weeks ago, SpaceX launched its 10,000th Starlink satellite. But that's only the start of this week's Starlink news. We've also got some good news for our European viewers. This week, International Airlines Group announced that it will install Starlink on over 500 airplanes. The group includes several European airlines, including British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus, Vueling, and Level. They plan to offer the service on long-haul routes as well as short-haul flights across Europe. Essentially, they'll install Starlink on all of the group's planes, except for the ones that'll be taken out of service for retirement soon. But what if you didn't just have great internet on planes, but everywhere? Well, SpaceX is working on that too. You might remember that a few months ago, SpaceX purchased $17 billion worth of spectrum licenses from EchoStar, but it seems the company wasn't done shopping for radio frequencies. This week, EchoStar announced that it had sold another license for approximately $2.6 billion in SpaceX stock. With all of these licenses, SpaceX now has access to an important part of the radio spectrum, which it can use to extend its direct-to-cell service. As the name suggests, this sends a cell phone signal directly to consumer devices, allowing for global 5G connectivity. So within a few years, you might be able to connect to the internet anywhere through Starlink with no cell tower in sight. Over the last few months, we've been following Astrolab as it prepares the Flip rover for its journey to the moon. And this week, the rover completed some important tests. You might remember that Flip entered the vacuum chamber a few weeks ago for thermal vacuum, or TVAC testing. During these tests, the rover was exposed to conditions similar to those on the lunar surface. This week, the test directors found that the rover withstood everything that they could throw at it and concluded that it had passed the test successfully. Flip is now back in the clean room while teams are reviewing the data. Astrolab designed Flip to fill an empty spot on Astrobotic's Griffin lander. The rover will verify technologies and designs for Astrolab's much larger Flex rover, which, if selected by NASA, will be used by the Artemis astronauts to drive around on the lunar surface. Among the things being tested on this rover are the wheels. Just last week, Astrolab announced that it had completed tire testing for Flip and Flex, exposing the tires to a variety of loads and moon-like situations. The company claims to have proven that the tires can withstand the extreme temperatures on the moon and conquer slopes up to 26 degrees. The Griffin lander with Flip on board is set to launch on the next Falcon Heavy mission, scheduled no earlier than July of 2026. Astra is testing engines for its upcoming Rocket 4. You may remember that just a few short years ago, in 2022, the company seemed to be on its last legs after its Rocket 3 failed again and again. But in recent months, it seems that the company is back from the dead, teasing plans for its next launch and even showing off some engines. This week, we got to see an engine hot fire lasting over 30 seconds. The company claims the test, quote, provided data in a thermal steady state, which will help them to optimize the combustion chamber. Reportedly, the engine is a modified version of Firefly's Reaver engine, which powers Firefly's Alpha rocket. Astra has modified the design for use on its own rocket. But that begs the question, where is Rocket 4? Though Astra has been happy to share engine testing, they have yet to show off any rocket in years. The company says that it wants to launch again next summer, but without any rocket hardware to show, it's hard to judge whether they'll be able to make that deadline or not. A company that does have a rocket to show is China's Galactic Energy. They've already launched their Series 1 rocket 21 times with only one failure. It uses solid propellants for the first 3 of its 4 stages, but now the company is working on a kerosene-fueled rocket called Jishenqing 1, or Palace 1, which is a medium-lift rocket with a first stage designed to be reused over 25 times. This rocket is slated to launch for the first time before Chinese New Year next February, and this week, its first stage completed a static fire test on the HOS-1 floating test bench near the port city of Tiangong. The test verified the rocket's 7 kerosene-powered engines, and all its pressurization systems functioned as intended. Galactic Energy plans to launch the rocket's maiden flight from its facilities at Zhochuan, which is a long way inland from Haiyang, where it was tested. Hopefully, we'll see the booster being moved there soon in preparation for this mission. Okay, now take a look at this. The European Space Agency just released this image from its Euclid Space Telescope. It covers a part of the sky over 3 times the area of the full moon and focuses on a dark cloud named LDN 1641, located 1,300 light-years away in the constellation of Orion. In the visible spectrum, there's not much to see, as dust blocks most of the light coming from behind. But Euclid imaged this bit of sky with its near-infrared spectrometer and photometer, or NISP, which revealed a spectacle of newborn stars amidst wispy clouds of dust and gas. Some of these young stars spewed out material during their formation, which appear in the picture as a colorful magenta nebula. While the world got its first glimpse at the image this week, Euclid actually captured the scene during its commissioning phase back in September of 2023. With this picture, the telescope proved that it was able to point precisely and reliably at its observation targets. It passed the test and captured the image in only 5 hours. In the years since, the telescope has been collecting data for its science mission, creating a detailed 3D map of nearly a third of the sky. As ESA published this image for us to marvel over, Euclid scientists released 7 more papers based on images captured by the telescope for its Q1 data release earlier this year. Among other things, the results detail the different shapes and types of more than 1.2 million galaxies observed. These results are only based on a fraction of Euclid's 6-year mission, so there's much more to come from this telescope. Before we look at the launches of the week, it's time for our monthly roundup of statistics. So get your calculators out as we recap October of 2025. Throughout the month, we had 25 launches. Unsurprisingly, SpaceX dominated the schedule with 15 launches, followed by the country of China, which launched 8 missions. Looking at 2025 as a whole thus far, we ended October with 253 launches worldwide, close to the record 259 launches from last year, although that record was already broken with the first few launches of November. The world is on track to hit over 300 launches by the end of the year, and it could in fact be as many as 310 launches. SpaceX has already launched 139 Falcon 9 missions through the end of October, and they're currently on track for 167 launches by the end of the year, very close to the company's target of 170 launches. And now let's have a look at the week's launches. It was another busy one with rockets lifting off from all around the world. From Florida, SpaceX launched the 4th mission of its bandwagon rideshare program on November 2nd. The flight carried 18 satellites into space, 13 of which were contracted through ExoLaunch. Another satellite was provided by StarCloud, which put NVIDIA GPUs into space to test space-based data centers. But probably the most anticipated passenger on this flight was Vast's Haven demo satellite, which you may remember from earlier in the episode. India also launched a military communications satellite aboard its LVM-3 rocket from the Satish Dhawan Space Center. The Indian Navy's GSAT-7R satellite was launched to replace the existing GSAT-7, which launched in 2013 and has well surpassed its planned 7-year mission. We also had launches of 3 Earth observation satellites. On November 4th, Europe launched the Sentinel-1D satellite on the 2 solid rocket booster version of Ariane 6. This latest addition to the Sentinel family will operate in tandem with its twin, Sentinel-1C, to observe our planet with its synthetic aperture radar, or SAR instrument. It'll be able to measure how the ground deforms from volcanic activity and earthquakes, map forests, and monitor sea ice and glaciers, among many other things. The day after, Rocket Lab's Electron lifted off from New Zealand, carrying a SAR satellite for Japanese company IQPS. This was Rocket Lab's 6th mission for the company, and it has 6 more contracted at this time. Rocket Lab dubbed the mission The Nation God Navigates as a nod to the Japanese god of nation building, Yachihoko. The 3rd Earth observation satellite launched from Wenchang in China atop a Changzheng 7A. We don't know much about this classified satellite, but official reports describe its purpose as surveying national resources, hydrology, and meteorology, as well as disaster management. Of course, we also had a few Starlink missions this week. 2 lifted off from Vandenberg in California, and the other started its journey from Cape Canaveral. Going into next week, the schedule is now highly uncertain due to the FAA limiting commercial launches as a result of the government shutdown. But there's a chance that we'll still get to see some exciting launches anyway. If all goes well, Blue Origin will launch its second New Glenn on November 9th before the FAA's rules go into effect. This launch will carry the 2 satellites for NASA's Escapade mission into space, where they'll be staged at Lagrange Point 2 ahead of their journey to Mars. Blue will attempt another booster landing on this mission, and the company's landing barge, Jacqueline, is already on its way to the landing location in the Atlantic. SpaceX had planned to launch its Transporter 15 rideshare mission from Vandenberg this week, as well as a few Starlink missions from Florida. Some of these missions may still happen, but we don't know anything for sure at this moment. There's also a chance that ULA might sneak in the Atlas V launch of Viasat 3 F2, which scrubbed a few times last week. We may also get a few launches from China, which obviously won't be subjected to the FAA rules, but if you want to keep an eye on the latest schedule, your best bet will be our next Spaceflight app and website. It's a great way to stay up to date, and it's completely free. And that's your weekly update of Spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in Spaceflight.